I can't think of a clever segue into our topic from this, but so let's just jump straight into it. One proposal I made was to talk a bit about asymptotics, or uh, what could be said in a more elementary way as making proper distinctions between rates of growth of quantities that are growing without bound. And the context where that came up for us last week was in the AI safety seminar, where we were discussing attempts to make AIs, which are very capable, safe or aligned. And if that is a process that requires human reasoning, then there's a problem, because human reasoning capacity, whether as individuals or collectives, doesn't seem to be growing like n squared, let alone e to the n, whereas capabilities of AIs may be growing like one of those. So that's what makes fundamentally AI safety a scary problem. And I did wonder if disruption studies, or whatever you would like to call it, had any insight to offer about processes like that. I mean, it's a general phenomenon of control theory or cybernetics or feedback or complex systems, of course, right? So it does seem like there might be some conceptual tools available, or I was just interested to hear your kind of thoughts on that, Adam.
Well, unfortunately, I think that you listed the pretty much comprehensively, as far as I can tell, the examples in which we see and draw upon theory and real world examples for phenomena that um, display feedback, that where the feedback is results in a complex pattern. And by complex, I mean that in the formal sense. But take the most familiar, the most standard one that I see in disruption is simply this sigmoid function, right? This is just an S curve of some sort. And so what you have is yes, it's nonlinear, and yes, it's complex in some manner. Um, but what we have is a exponential growth in some initial phase, and then some point at which that inflects into exponential decay and asymptotically approaches some limit, and so you get a sigmoid function. You get some sigmoid shape to some function. Now, the prevailing thinking, at least as far as technology's disruptions go, is that there are just a number of interacting causal feedback loops that initially the relationships between the different quantities cause accelerating adoption, so an increase in the rate of adoption per time step initially, and but that at some point past certain thresholds in the values of the parameters that are involved, the quantities that are involved, those feedback loops flip, they switch from being or rather I should say the whole system switches from being dominated by reinforcing feedback loops that drive the acceleration to what in systems thinking lingo and are called balancing feedback loops that decelerate and cause the rate of change to slow down. So yeah, this is not something that we've quantified very effectively, and I'm hesitant to try.
Yeah, I guess I'm also not
I think that
reaching for.
there are risks in that, but
Yeah, I guess I'm not reaching for formal treatments, but more like. So I can imagine that. So the criticism I was laying of, ignorant as I am, of the literature on some of these topics to do with intelligence explosions and so on is to talk too casually about infinities, right? To just to treat things as kind of static end goals rather than processes that are evolving, and to not examine into whether the gaps between things are growing or shrinking over time, even if both of them are going to infinity. And it wasn't immediate to me that this is a topic that's come up naturally in the context of disruption, but it seems like it ought to come up. Now, things don't go to infinity in the disruptions that you're talking about, right? But the rate of change of some things might effectively seem to be extremely large if you're dealing with like a phase transition in physics or in statistics is a phenomena where you go from one stable equilibrium to another over some period of time. When a control parameter is varied, it might be temperature or pressure or price in the case of disruptions like the ones we've been discussing in this seminar, perhaps. Where you have a stable equilibrium, the system's kind of locked into a certain configuration and it's persisted for a long time, and then 10 years later, 15 years later, it's in a different stable equilibrium. And in between, maybe in practice in the real world, you don't see divergences where things go to infinity. You don't see that in physics either. It's not like there's a phase transition when you boil water, and the average radius of a bubble of air inside the water is one of these divergent quantities. It's not infinite. You don't have infinitely large bubbles in your teapot. But relative to the microscopic scale, they are infinite, right? Of course, before you boil your water, there are small air bubbles. Their radius is on the order of, I don't know, it's probably on the order of 10 or 1,000 atoms, I suppose. But it diverges to being many, many orders of magnitude larger, macroscopically perceptible. That's effectively a divergence to infinity from the point of the microscopic scale. So this is an example that I have in mind when people talk about intelligence explosions, right? They clearly are referring to some kind of phase transition, but in the real world, you never see infinities. You see something that on a microscopic scale is effectively infinite, and on some other scale looks noticeable. And that's how macroscopic things often become noticeable, and why we notice phase transitions like boiling water or any other phase transition that comes up naturally, super saturated fluids or anything like that. So in the context of disruption, what I'm curious about is so when you're going through a phase transition, so there's some divergence. So maybe it's the rate of change of the ratio of one product being used to another, right? So that ratio switches from being very small when product. So I don't know if this is going to work, but let's think about this as an example. So if A is the units sold of product curly A, and B is the units sold of product curly B, well, those are functions of time, and you might look at AT on BT, and that's for T very much less than some critical time. This is small, say. So this is B dominates, or we're in a stable equilibrium where B is preferred. But for T much greater than TC, this is large, so this is after the phase transition has happened, so A is preferred. Now this is never infinite, right? It just goes from, maybe being nearly 0 to being, maybe 10 or 100 or something. But the kind of thing you might expect is that the derivative diverges as T approaches the critical time. So at the critical time, it's any given unit of time, the ratio increases very, very rapidly, something like that. And what I'm interested in is, in disruptions like this one, do you typically track just one of these divergent quantities, or is it common to track multiple ones?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I can see a parallel there for this, a description of an intelligence explosion. Let me run you through. There are a couple things to say here. Um, don't, if you would, remind me to come back to this idea of balancing feedback loops and one exponential uh, counterbalancing another exponential. Let me come back to that later. Don't let me forget. There might be something interesting there. But for right now, um, uh, the for all practical purposes during a disruption, um, we we ignore the rate of change in uh, for the incumbent industry or product or service or market segment or technology. So whatever the incumbent entity is, whatever that is, if in practice we effectively assume that it is no longer uh, or is not making improvements that continue to be relevant during the disruption. Now, it may be that there are times when an incumbent industry or an incumbent business, for example, tries to react to a disruption by making an existing product or service better, by trying to improve its quality and or its cost, so that its value grows, and in an attempt to remain competitive with, for example, a new disruptive technology that is posing an overwhelming competitive threat. Now, we we can imagine, or we can think through some example. Brad would be the person for me to really appeal to here for historical examples, because he's an encyclopedia of these things now. But it would be something like an effort to make film cameras, a desperate effort in the late 90s to make film cameras cheaper to keep them competitive with digital cameras, or to make a desperate bid that only lasts for a brief time to keep an incumbent technology relevant or competitive, especially in the early days when the disruptive technology is not perfected. This is one of the strange things about disruption, is that adoption of the new technology begins before it's perfected. The technologies often are pretty crappy in the early days. The early adopters of a new technology bless them, are often willing to suffer through the growing pains of the technology is not completely perfected, it doesn't perform very well, and it's not as affordable as it one day will be. But nevertheless, adoption does get going despite that imperfection. So,
Like the poor schmucks who
so
suffer through
admitting that
MetaUnit.
these two things are there. Sorry, go ahead.
I said, like the poor folks who suffer through the early version of MetaUnit tools.
Yeah, so I mean, this is completely standard, but for the purposes of our analysis, we very seldom, if ever, consider the the continuation of any pre-existing growth trend or improvement trend um, of the incumbent technology. Now, this is perhaps a problem. I mean, it doesn't seem to alter the overarching dynamics, but when I think about it, for sure, in most disruptions, the incumbency isn't you know, completely ossified and standing still and doing nothing. A lot of things are going on. Their cost structures are changing, and there are often quite desperate measures that the incumbency will take to stay alive a little bit longer or to profit on the way down. That actually can be a very successful strategy to profit as the industry is collapsing. That's certainly something that uh, disruptees have successfully executed in the past. But what we typically don't have in my team's work anyway, and any that I can think of, um, is looking at sort of the divergence of the rates of change from the incumbency, which is got during these long acquiescent periods of where between disruptions where there's some sort of stable metastable or partially stable homeostasis of some sort, where that you've got some technology ecosystem, it's fairly stable, and maybe it's improving slowly and incrementally, and perhaps even linearly over time. But the change is slow, and then maybe perhaps by an analogy, similar to raising the temperature of a liquid, that can be occurring slowly and steadily, and then that's very different than what's going on in a phase change, as to kind of use your analogy from earlier. But so I can see the difference, at least in my mind. Sorry, let me back up a second. If I think about it, a typical technology disruption, we really have two trends. One is the growth of or the rate of change of the incumbent technology, and one is the rate of change in the new disruptive technology. And there's a massive divergence between those two. And that rate of change, what I'm talking about there is really fundamentally about cost or economic value. And the result of those changes, the new technologies getting cheaper and or performing better, but some combination that presents a value proposition. The new technology is improving way, way, way faster than the old technology is capable of improving. And then the result of that divergence, the result of that difference between the two, is that the new technology begins to be adopted and displace the older technology in a market, and the market itself may grow. So the market size is not fixed. That in fact, overwhelmingly, we see that new technologies, disruptive new technologies, grow markets substantially. We've seen that many, many, many times. But that's a consequence of the new technology becoming cheaper and better, much, much, much faster than the existing technology, the incumbent. And very importantly, it's common sense here, obviously, and very importantly, the trajectory of improvement of the new technology must take it to parity and then well beyond parity in order for it to be a disruption. A new technology could come along, but if it never got as cheap and then substantially cheaper than the existing technology, well, then it wouldn't have a disruptive impact. So that's a sort of precondition for a disruption to occur, is that the new technology not only must be improving very rapidly, this is what we always see, but it must be on a trajectory to become much better. And by better, I mean offer a much more compelling value proposition in terms of cost and quality and performance and that sort of thing than the incumbent. Okay, so that's what you've got going on. Now, the parallel that I can imagine between those two things and what we are perhaps facing with an intelligence explosion is that humanity, and I mean humanity, I don't mean necessarily even individual human minds, I mean humanity and human institutions. I think that it's probably fair to say that humanity's been getting smarter. And we could think about, over the course of evolutionary time, where have we had, phase changes, and where have we had sort of more slow, steady, incremental improvements or expansions in intelligence? I don't know how we want to operationalize intelligence and distinguish that from things like knowledge. I'm not sure, but I think what we could say is that say, take for example, over the last 1,000 years, there was some point at which the right pieces came together, and humanity started becoming a fair bit smarter collectively, and perhaps even individuals. I mean, with better nutrition and better education and so on, an individual person in 2022 is honest to goodness smarter than they would have been with identical genes in the environment and nutritional and and educational and social environment of 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. But certainly collectively we have institutions, corporations, governments, whatever, universities, academia that are themselves, they are in a form of incumbency, and they are getting smarter collectively. Humanity has been getting smarter, And so it's not like this is something completely, it's just a static quantity. I think there has been a rate of improvement. But I think this is directly analogous to the rate of improvement that we see in an incumbent industry or technology. And then with a disruptive technology coming in, well, AGI would be something directly analogous to that. And it is getting its performance per unit cost and its the value proposition of it to a potential market is just improving in a completely different way, a completely different ball game. It's just like it's not even comparable. It's much faster, and with that crucial caveat there that it's on a trajectory to exceed the incumbency. And so there's this the pieces that would normally be there for an imminent technology disruption appear to be there for an imminent intelligence disruption of intelligence. Now maybe this is a similar phenomenon. Maybe it really is a technological disruption of a extraordinary kind.
Let me put
But
you
at any
on.
rate, that we seem to be in a similar sort of situation. So that's my sort of approximate, my rough, hot take. That's what I'm looking for. That's my hot take on it.
Well, let me put you on the
Is
spot
that it
then,
fits the pattern?
as a representative of
Yeah.
Rethink X. Okay, what good are you guys if you can't say anything useful about this one? This disruption, okay, electric cars, good for you. Energy, good for you. Food, yeah, food's nice. If the framework of dealing with the disruptions can't offer anything useful beforehand about this particular disruption, what good is it at all? And what do you have to
I
offer?
happen to I think I have to agree that we're in a tough spot. I don't know what we have to offer here. Oh wait, did I lose my connection? Okay, so my response is I think that what's happening here is fundamentally different. I think there is something fundamentally different than any other disruption that we have seen, um, uh, and I think it's different in a way that makes it uh, much less predictable, and makes it very much harder to say anything about. And the reason why I think is that technologies disruptions. What is technology? Well, my working definition of technology is that it is a form of practical knowledge, but knowledge stands in relation to an agent or set of agents with intelligence. So then it's one reason why I mentioned why I distinguished knowledge and intelligence a few minutes ago. And I think the it's one thing if you have a new form of knowledge, practical knowledge, i.e., a new technology emerge, and then suddenly the intelligent agents find that new form of knowledge so useful that it becomes uh, it becomes adopted very quickly following these consistent patterns that we've seen throughout history and displaces older forms of knowledge that are suddenly less useful and therefore no longer compete and hold the attention or they no longer retain a user base amongst the intelligent agents that are taking advantage or utilizing that knowledge. Okay, that's all fine and dandy. But when suddenly you flip this situation and you're talking about the improvement or the new disruptor is intelligence itself, then that breaks our models. That breaks my team's. That breaks what we do, because then you're talking about changing the agents themselves, and this is like there's some recursive trap there. There's some sort of like um, you're dividing by zero or some such analogy, right? I mean, it's I can't make sense of it, because if intelligence itself is the thing that's growing, and it's the thing that's disrupting, then yeah, it just breaks the models. It breaks my thinking. It's one reason why I find this so both exciting and terrifying. Is I honestly don't. I do not know how to think about or make any forecasting. Um, during and certainly not beyond the disruption. I mean, if we're talking about having fundamentally more intelligent more intelligence than the agents that are intelligent right now. Yeah, that completely throws me for a loop. So, um, I
Is there a dual point of view where rather than people adopting technology, technology adopts people?
well, certainly technology acquires users. It's. I mean, technology. Like, I think there's a very good reason why uh, the idea of memes has become captivating, you know uh, has proven itself to be a useful concept. Dawkins' original idea of a meme is goes back quite a long way, and now memes are they're entertainment and whatnot. But the idea that knowledge is viral in some sense, and that viruses capture and use hosts to propagate themselves, or at least there are dynamics that effectively create a pattern of behaviors that looks like that. Well, yeah, I think that's there's absolutely something to that. Now, in this case, it may be that it's a little more literal than figurative. It was literally intelligence and intelligent, agents and entities and beings coming into existence and capturing the users. But in some figurative or metaphorical sense, all technologies do that to some degree, as all knowledge does that to some degree.
I wonder if there's a body of quantitative work that could predict the rough order of magnitude of animals in terms of number of cells. I mean, suppose you're sitting back at the Cambrian Revolution and you see multicellular life start to emerge. You might, if you were a single celled Kurzweil, predict that the number of cells in an organism will be growing exponentially and that, within 20 years will fill up the solar system or something. But that isn't what we see. I mean, there's a kind of competing pressure which is from viruses, bacteria, parasites, smaller things that can nonetheless be very effective against big things, which put an upper bound, pretty strong upper bound on the size of animals. I mean, from this order of magnitude calculation, a dinosaur and a cat are kind of equivalent things, right? It's, I don't know how many cells there are in a human body, but it's something on the order of 1 trillion, I think. We don't see 10 trillion cell or 100 trillion or 1,000. What's that, a quadrillion? So this is changing the topic a little bit, I guess, but I'm wondering what an intelligence explosion may have natural parasites as well, right? Or some other countervailing force that means that it doesn't necessarily explode 1,000 orders of magnitude beyond human intelligence. So in the context of technological disruption, I mean, you think about the roof where the thing converges and sort of slows down and becomes a new stable equilibrium as being dictated by what? The limitations of the technology itself, I guess, right? There's not like an active countervailing to come back to balancing exponentials. Disruptions stop when they hit the limitations of the technology, generally speaking, right?
Well, they stop when they hit the limits of the technology. When the technology hits the limits of the it hits the limits of the physical system in which it's instantiated. In other words, the limits of the substrate. And the substrate is comprised. I mean, a lot of this is maybe too much through an economic lens, but the substrate, in my mind, is that upon which technologies play out, are utilized, and produce and reproduce themselves, and then are used and are used by human beings and our institutions and organizations. That substrate is determined by the supply and by the demand, right? So on the supply side, the technology is limited by the materials that are available and the constraints of production and manufacturing, and all those sorts of things on the supply side of the of this picture. And then it's also constrained by demand, and demand ultimately comes from the human population, and so demand is finite but growing because the human population is finite but growing. Um, so yeah, it there are the technologies live on a substrate that has limits, and it can't sort of a technology it can't expand beyond those substrates without something more, without some ability to affect or change or grow the substrate itself. Any given technology, and then a new technology that can come along and take advantage of the substrate in a different way can outcompete it. But intelligence is weird. Intelligence sort of seems like it has a fundamentally different character to it. I mean, look at human beings, right? I mean, human beings are very fundamentally different at exploiting the biosphere and all of the natural resources on the surface of the planet. Fundamentally different way of doing that than any other animal. And in an open-ended and dynamic and adaptive way. And so intelligence is this asterisk. It's this wild card that flips the script by changing the relationship to the substrate itself, as it were. And I'm not confident that we aren't going to see something very similar to that with an intelligence explosion. We know, regardless of how far up the next asymptote is, like what limits the AGI hits. I mean, maybe it hits some limits and breaks through those over time, and there may be sequences, there may be a succession of S curves, or a succession of phase changes. But I have no reason to imagine that the very next phase change, the first one even if there is a sequence ahead and not a single giant leap to whatever the universe's limit is, I have no reason personally, I can't think of a reason to imagine why the very next one, in other words, the one that's the age that artificial intelligence is on right now, is not going to reach a point where the capacity to modify the existing substrate that it's operating on is going to be mind-boggling. And I think this is where a lot of the concerns emerge from. If artificial general intelligence could be smart enough to maybe sufficiently intelligent enough to obtain the capability of transforming and utilizing our planet and our solar system's resources in ways that are so capable that they're terrifying, right? So
if I teleported you in front of a joint meeting of Xi Jinping and Biden right now, and Biden was awake, what would your how would you set AGI policy? I mean, as a representative of Rethink X, and he's put you in charge, saying, "I don't know what's going to happen." That's not good enough. So,
yeah, you're right. I mean, what do we actually recommend, and what do we recommend to policymakers? I suppose I would have to say that it's not reasonable or realistic. It's neither. Because it's unrealistic. It is not reasonable to presume that there's any way to stop AGI development. I think that there's no way to prevent some rogue actor from progressing on this trajectory. I don't see that as reasonable or realistic, and therefore recommending any policy of containment, I think, is probably futile and would lead to very, very dangerous complacency. Um, so the my recommendation, I suppose, would have to then be uh, based on the assumption that this is an arms race. It's a race and we're under race conditions, and that is not avoidable or containable or preventable. And remember, you would have to, at least in principle, prevent this for however long it takes to be able to allow it to then continue safely. Well, how long is that going to take? 10 years or 1 year or 1,000 years until we know how to do this safely, if ever? It's containment, and it could fail at any moment. All in that time, this just seems unrealistic to me.
Well, Matt
So
has
my recommendation
one
would be
year
to,
left in his masters, and then a 3-year PhD, and then it'll be solved. So.
well, so my recommendation would be that the that a very that a that in order to minimize the risk, we ought to endeavor to make an AGI that its creation ought to be undertaken under the circumstances that we can currently imagine are most likely to lead to an AGI having as little alignment problems as possible. I guess you could say it the other way around. You could say it lead to an AGI that is as benevolent or amiable or amicable or towards human beings as possible. But probably you want to think about it, the other way around, which is make it as least antagonistic, as least hostile as possible. And are there any ways that we can think of that might distinguish pathways for developing AGI that are more or less likely to lead to hostility? And so, for example, training artificial intelligences to achieve goals that have the potential to be destructive is probably not a great idea. So you probably don't want to be running this AI/AGI race with developing these systems for things like military use or advertising, convincing people to buy things as much as possible. You probably don't want to be training these systems, rooting them in values like greed or exploitation or competence at winning conflicts, like military. So in other words, I guess it's we right now. What are the main things we're using? What are the main things we're using narrow AI for? We're using it for things like, spying on people. I'm thinking of the alphabet agencies in the United States. We're using it for trying to sell people shit they don't need. That's advertising. We're using it for gambling on Wall Street and other for trading. And perhaps we're using it for some sort of military applications. None of these to me seem to be a good basis for running this race, because if one of those candidates pulls out into the lead and wins the race and becomes fully generalized, well, it's not that, maybe that's not built on the wisest of foundations. But you can't not run the race. That's not realistic. So what do? Well, you've got to run the race, and you've got to win it with something that's built on a better foundation. And I don't know what that foundation is, but I certainly wouldn't build it on the foundation of trying to maximize returns on investment on Wall Street. And I certainly wouldn't want, Facebook, which most of its research is dedicated towards maximizing advertising dollars and addicting people to social media and clicks. I think that's probably not the best foundation. You might want to build it on some other basis. Certainly, I would want to train AGI on the very best things about humanity rather than the very worst things. And so what are the best things? Well, maybe we ought to train AGI on our literature and our music and our philosophy and, that sort of thing. but I come here with in desperation, appealing to you, much smarter fellows than me, to figure out what the fuck we're going to do, because I'm losing sleep at night over this. I thought we had 30 to 50 years, and it really wasn't going to be a problem. And I had a whole career of just mundane disruption predicting about solar panels and shit like that ahead of me. I did not think you fucking guys in computer science were going to crack AGI before 2030, and now it seems like that's maybe a possibility. And I'm losing sleep over this. I don't know what the fuck we do.
So, what is? I mean, okay, a lot of what you said I agree with, but in some sense, there's no comparative advantage for you to say it or Rethink X to say it. So, in my mental categorization of where Rethink X sits, your skill seems to be to go beyond this kind of. I mean, people talk about AI safety and these concerns, and it's philosophical, and that's fine, and it's kind of prognostication in this rough fashion. But what you're very good at is going from first principles and actually building a damn model, right? And then running the model and extracting some not obvious a priori, but after the fact, kind of reasonable observations about how things might play out. So my question is, okay, not recommendations like nationalize Facebook. Fine, go ahead, do that, throw it in the ocean. I don't care. But what model can you run? What is an interesting question about the near-term development of this race that is not obvious right now, but which is consequential? That's kind of a question I feel like in a year from now, I could imagine you telling me something I didn't know about how this race is likely to play out, or moves you can make in this race that could avoid the worst forms of the race, where people do pour even more billions of dollars into optimizing large models to ends that we don't really want them to be optimized for. Where's the lever, Adam, to pull?
Yeah, you I'm hoping to pull a rabbit out of my hat here at some point. But I have been stewing and stewing and stewing on this, and I'm not seeing any clear ways in which the lessons of past disruptions really apply here. I mean, we have identified a number of sort of principles that are informative and that are not obvious, as you say, in prospectively, but in retrospect, they make very good sense. These are things like the uh, new technologies they tend not to simply replace older ones on a one by one substitution basis, but rather they tend um, to create a whole new possibility space, and as a result, the market and or system based on those new technologies tends to be much larger and much more capable than the older system that it replaces. And there are exceptions to that. I mean, there are things like ballpoint pens that come along and really are just a substitute, and don't necessarily completely transform, the way we're writing with pencils and fountain pens, for example. Even though on a product, in a product category sense, they are quite disruptive, and in that they capture market share. But in many other instances, we do see phenomena where a disruption changes the underlying system itself, changes the way we produce goods and services using those technologies and so forth. So that's one example of the kind of insight that comes out of the work that we do. We have a handful of things like that, but none of them. I mean, they all they are. What's I guess the best thing that I could say is that we would be reasoning by analogy and not knowing whether or not the analogies hold, with the suspicion that they won't, because something is fundamentally new and novel and different about intelligence as a technology compared to all of the other technologies we've developed in the past. So we could try to imagine, what is the market for intelligence? What is the incumbent artificial intelligence market, and what value proposition does that hold, and what what value does it create? What production does it facilitate today, and what would a much larger, expanded market and greater space of possibilities look like in the future? But again, that seems like a pretty weak and not particularly useful or powerful conclusion to draw in this instance, right? So
here's an idea for you. So here's my conspiracy theory. I think Satoshi Nakamoto is a time traveler. He came back in time and invented Bitcoin in order to slow down AGI by 5 years, because the Bitcoin miners bought up all the GPUs and sunk incredible millions of dollars and starved the world of GPUs and spent them, running some pointless algorithm to secure some, experiment in currency, instead of accelerating the development of AIs.
I like this. It's like you've got a movie idea for the what is this, Satoshi? What is the
Satoshi Nakamoto.
Bitcoin founder?
Yeah.
Satoshi Nakamoto. And there's my understanding is that the identity is still a mystery, whether it's an individual person or
correct,
or a group of people or what. Yeah, it's right. There's a lot of intrigue behind Bitcoin, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it could be the good basis for a good sci-fi story.
I guess we got 5 minutes left. I wanted to.
Yeah, I mean,
I wanted to come back to that idea.
So I was just going to say
profiting on the way down. But
sorry, anyway, go.
I wanted to get you to explain what you meant by profiting
ahead,
on the way down, but I think we have a bit of lag here. So you go ahead and say what you were going to say.
Well, I can do both of those things. So I'll just finish the thought that I had, and then I'll talk about the profiting on the way down. So the overarching formula that Rethink X uses, it's not really a secret, but it's right there in the title of our organization, is that basically what we do is we use a not particularly mind-blowing theoretical foundation to look at phenomena that match a pattern. And then what we really do is we say, okay, if you know that this remarkable phase change is coming, or if you have a reasonable expectation that it's coming in a given industry or market or something like that, then then this justifies rethinking your basic assumptions about yourself, about your industry, your business models, your competitors, the value that you're creating and offering to users in the world, the trade-offs that you might be making. It's an opportunity to really challenge assumptions. Okay, so that's at the most fundamental level what we really do. And so the question is there something that we can do along those lines that would be a novel insight? Because there have been a lot of people been trying to do that with respect to artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and super intelligence. And there, Bostrom has written his book, and lots of others have as well, and there are a few of these research institutes. So the question is whether there really are any assumptions that have not already been challenged, and any insights that can be drawn from those. So that's just completing that thought. To answer your question about profiting on the way down, what we've seen in the past is that industries that come to terms with the fact that disruption is imminent and unavoidable, and it doesn't work so well for entire industries, but it works well for individual businesses and for investors. What we see is that it's possible to change the way you operate a business knowing that collapse is coming. So, for example, one thing that you can do is you can begin aggressively divesting from holdings in the industry, and uh, you can sell off assets, and you can continue to operate and provide a goods or services without incurring any of the normal expenses for operational upkeep, for the purchasing of new assets that would then be necessary to continue operating into the future. You can just stop all of that. You can eliminate all of that expense um, that is associated with believing you have a future and planning for the long term. And so if you're a big industry, if you're the energy sector, for example, you could run power plants and just stop investing in all of the assets and maintenance and those sorts of things that you would normally need to invest in to keep running decade after decade. And as a result, you can slash your costs in the short term, and demand is still there, and the new technology has not come in and replaced has not replaced you in the marketplace yet. But if that's imminent and is coming, you can profit in the meantime by slashing your costs. And so this is a pattern that we see where the incumbents, if they're wise, can profit on the way down as they're crashing and burning by slashing their costs and pulling out and divesting from their own industry. Does that make sense? There are actually people who are a little more cynical than that. There are people investors who actively short industries that they believe are going to collapse and lose value. So there's you can profit in that way. But that's not really what I was talking about. That's a little more trite, as it were. But the craftier way that businesses profit during periods of recession or ultimately collapse, if the recession is permanent, is to take actions that slash costs in the near term, while revenues are still high, so that they radically expand their margins, and then to pull the profit out of that while they can. And the problem, of course, is that people can do this on the sly. So the companies, for example, can make a whole bunch of false promises and become very profitable and pass all that on to shareholders, knowing that they're not going to be able to meet their debt obligations in the future. And so they just, and then they know they're going to go bankrupt. They know they're going to leave unwary investors out in the wind. They know they're going to leave creditors out pissing in the wind. They know they're going to leave, pensioners who they have obligations to. They know they're going to default on all of their obligations, but they can profit in the short term by slashing just sort of the operating costs and that sort of thing. So this is something that we see again and again, and we try to warn policymakers and other civic leaders and other decision makers about those dirty tricks, to expect those from the incumbency and to be on guard for them. So
we've run out of time today, but do you see the analogy I'm making here?
Where is that?
The second board.
Let me see.
Maybe we are the incumbents. So that's your official recommendation, Adam. Thanks.
I tell you what, I will give this some serious thought this week, and I will see if I can pull more of a rabbit out of the hat. I will give it some serious thought. Like if suddenly someone said, okay, a week from tomorrow, you're gonna have 15 minutes with Sleepy Joe in the White House, and you gotta tell him something. I'll see if I can come up with something for that.
Great. Okay, I gotta hop off for the next session, but thanks a lot, Adam. That was fun.
Sure. Thanks. Bye, guys.